Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning.
You know what's strange is you hear people reading your bio all the time, and then at some point, just one thing suddenly strikes you. And today, as I was listening to it, I just suddenly heard she got this when she started speaking as a college student in the 70s. And I thought, why would somebody put in that was the 70s? Okay. I was a real prodigy. You know, I was in college when I was like 8 years old. It's amazing what suddenly strikes you, isn't it? It is truly a privilege for me to be part of your conference here this week. And I was asked to speak on the spiritual place of women, and I hope that you'll allow me to kind of play around with that in a way that might be a little bit different from what you expected. Because as I was thinking about this women's spiritual place in the world, women's spiritual voice in the world, I started thinking about women's voice, just women's voices. You know, I sometimes get into these places where I come up with a title thinking about one particular thing, and then in between coming up with the title and the thing actually happening, life happens. And when life happens, then I just have to take life and go where it leads. And so when I was thinking about the title, I was particularly thinking about women's role in spiritual life. But as this year has unfolded, I have been paying attention to where and how we hear women's voices. And in particular, where and how we hear the voices of women, less privileged women in particular, and especially women of Africa. And one of the reasons that I kind of have played around with this is I was at a conference earlier this spring in San Francisco that was focusing on women's spirituality and women's spiritual voices. And as I sat in that room, and it was an amazing conference. We were there for 3 days, and wonderful speakers, great panels, wonderful interaction in the room. And you know, it was truly an empowering experience. But as I sat in that room, I realized that there were so many women missing. And in particular, for me, the women missing were the women of Africa. That when we spoke of the women of the developing world, the women of Africa in the conference, when they were spoken about as people upon whom others acted. So they were spoken about as objects. And as an African woman raised by African women and raising African women, though my daughters, I have to digress here for a second, because I went to my middle child's school where she was speaking on a panel, and the panel was about what does it feel like about being in this school, and what are the pros and cons, and all the rest. It was an all-girls school, and with a large international student population. And as we're listening to the panel, my daughter says, well, in fact, I'm the only American in my class. And I was like, and yeah, she's American, and she had to say it for it to sink in for me, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm raising Africans, and there are conflicts and wonderful joys in having both Africans and Americans in the same person. But so for me, part of this conversation is about being an object in other people's conversations, and I started reflecting back on the women whom I have known in Africa and around the world. And surprisingly enough, well, maybe not surprising, but part of what struck me as I reflected on women in Africa, but women around the world, was the way in which we, as women, in a way, feed into that sense of us being objects. And in particular, I thought back to the field work that I did working on the PhD. And as another aside, I've put aside the PhD. It's been too long in the writing. You know, by the time it came out, it was going to be a history book, and it wasn't supposed to be. And so, named my son, who came while I was thinking I was finishing. His middle name is PhD, just so that people will leave me alone, you know? They won't say, so what happened to the PhD? Here he is, okay? Thank you. But as I was working on my PhD, the research in a rural community in South Africa, and this was towards the end of apartheid. And this community was a community that was a migrant community, meaning that this was a community that was what under apartheid was a Bantustan, those so-called independent African places inside South Africa, which had no economic resources at all. And so the men from those communities worked as migrant workers in so-called white South Africa. And so the community was 90%, the adults of the community were 90% women most of the time. And I had gone there to find out how women in those situations survive economically. Because, you know, there was the myth that men as migrants sent most of their wages home to support their families. And the reality was that men sent very little money home. They would bring money back with them when they came on their annual vacation, but that in fact that they were not the ones supporting the family by sending remittances every month, and trying to find out what it was that women in those communities did to survive. And I started off by interviewing women, young women, old women, asking them, what is it that you do in this community? What do you do? Not just what do you do to sustain yourself, but what do you do? And over and over and over again, women would say to me, I do nothing. I'm like, no, I mean, really, what do you do? No, my child, you know, I do nothing. I do nothing. And so I decided that, you know, I need to find out what nothing looks like. And so I followed one woman for one day, once a month. Now, when I started the project, my plan was to follow one woman for one day every week. But after following the first two women, I couldn't keep up with their nothing. I needed a long time to recuperate from their nothing. Because these women were getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning to go and get water and firewood, making sure that when their children got ready to go to school, there was hot water for them to wash, that there was something for them to eat. They were sending their children out to school. I mean, if my children looked half as tidy walking out of my house as these women had their children walking out, I mean, I tell people that we do have an iron in my house. We really do. We look upon it as something of an exhibit. But I really keep it for South Africans. Because when South Africans iron everything, and when South Africans visit you, they want an iron. I mean, you can say to them, we're just going down. I need to iron my jeans. Okay, strange people. But these women, children, walked out with white shirts, ironed, looking amazing. And they were ironing these shirts on a table with a blanket on it with those, do you remember? You probably don't, I don't know what I'm saying. Those old black irons that you put on the fire and warm up and then wipe off to make. So they were doing that. That was part of their nothing. And then they would be out in the fields, helping one another on their fields, weeding, sowing, whatever needed to be happening at that time. They were walking into the nearest town to buy in bulk cabbages, potatoes, candy, to come back and sell to one another in the village. They were brewing beer to sell to the people who worked in the military base a few miles down the road. They were on the go the whole day. And yet, when they were asked, what do you do? They said, nothing. And my first thought was, this is part of our problem as African women, is that we are all too willing to minimize what it is we do. But as I lived around the world, I realized that actually it's not just African women, that this is a womanly trait. And it is a trait that does not serve us well. Because for those women, when I said to them finally one day, do you know that this so-called nothing you do is actually what sustains this country? Because your nothing is what is producing the workers for the South African economy that are making the South African economy such a wealthy economy on the continent while you struggle to survive. That, do you realize that the nothing that you do is what sustains this community, so that when those men do come home, that they have a home to come home to, that they have a community, a village that is standing, that is functioning, that they have children who are taken care of, that they have a house that continues to stand even as they don't send you anything to sustain you. And I tell that story not because I am trying in a way, in some way to blame the victim. But I tell that story because I think that there is a way in which we allow our stories to be told, particularly as women. We allow our stories to be told as though we were not really a part of that story, that we were visitors to what happens. And when I talk about the conference in San Francisco, I said at one point, I am so struck by who is missing from this room. That who is missing is not that they are missing in that we don't hear about them, but they are missing because we hear about them, we don't hear from them. And when I see the videos or hear the stories of women, in particularly women in the developing world, and I see these stories of these women are suffering, these women are waiting for you to come and help them, these women are simply oppressed, I think we miss so much of the stories of those women by simply seeing them as people who wait to be acted upon. That we so rarely hear the stories of the actions that women in developing countries are taking. And yet, that is the bulk of the story. It is a story of people who are activists in their lives. How many of you are familiar with the film, I always get it wrong, Sing, Dance the Devil Back to Hell? Pray. There you go. See, I so much stay away from praying that, singing just sounds so much more fun. Pray the devil back to hell. And this is the story of the women of Liberia. Now, I want to bet that those of you who are aware of the civil war in Liberia, probably most of you not aware that that civil war was fundamentally ended by the women of Liberia. The women who said, we are tired of having ourselves and our children tormented, killed. We are tired of living in a country where we are not safe. And we are going to use the tools that we have to bring an end to this conflict. And they didn't have many tools, but they combined as women across the different faiths and protested outside the places of meeting of the leaders of government and the rebel organizations, and they sat there day after day saying, we are not going to be moved until you stop this conflict. And when the negotiations started to bring some kind of transitional phase to Liberia, that they sat outside the hotel where the negotiations were happening and said, we're not letting you leave this hotel until you have reached an agreement. And they said, when people thought about trying to leave, they said, we are going to strip naked. Now talk about using the tools that you have, as limited as they may be. We are going to strip naked as old women here in front of you if you try and leave. Knowing that many taboos had gone by the wayside in Liberia during the war. But one of the taboos that had not gone by the wayside was the ill that is brought upon someone, a young man, to see an old woman naked. That disrespect that implied was ill fortune for that young man. And they said, we will. Just try. And those men, and that's another story, is why was it almost all men in the negotiations? But that's another story. But they went back and they reached an agreement. And those women then were active in ensuring the election of Ellen Sirleaf Johnson as the president of Liberia, the first female president on the African continent. So, and when we hear the stories of Liberia in this country and around the world, that is not a story that is heard. We do hear the stories of women who have been violated, women who have been amputated by rebels, but we don't hear the stories of women organizing themselves. When we hear the stories of Rwanda, we hear the stories of the genocide. We hear sometimes the story of how the country decided to go back to traditional ways of dealing with conflict and calling in the community court system to deal with healing, restoring communities following that genocide. We don't hear of how the women of Rwanda said, our absence in political leadership is part of the reason that our country was able to go into that genocidal mode. And therefore, we are not going to allow our country to be without our voices in leadership. So that today, Rwanda's parliament is one of those that has the highest percentage of women in the world. In the world. So when we hear stories of women, for me, the great sadness is we don't often hear the stories from women. That then the story becomes not so much the story of the women, but really the story of the teller and what he or she has done to help these powerless women. That when we see pictures or when we are told about disasters or suffering, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we must stop hearing the stories of disasters, of struggle, but what I am saying is that what we so often get is a sense of a people waiting. And that is so far from the truth. I mean, if the women of Africa were simply waiting, there would be no people left on the African continent, seriously. If they were only waiting for the world to help them, then we would have disappeared a long time ago from the face of the planet. Because when we talk about first responders, when we talk about first responders to disaster, to need, we are usually talking about women. So when people talk about AIDS orphans on the African continent, the first people to care for them are not missionaries or charities from outside. It is women in the very communities from which they come who either take them into their own home or help them to maintain their home. One of the things that I do is I take groups to South Africa for different types of groups, school groups, church groups, women's groups, that kind of stuff. And a couple of years ago, I took a group from a church in Nashville. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Yeah, I know. If you had told me when I was 14 that I was going to end up in Nashville, Tennessee, I'd have laughed too. So, God has a sense of humor. What can we say? But I took a group from this church, which is one of the wealthiest churches in Nashville, to South Africa on a partnership trip. And another aside, don't talk to me about mission trips, please. It just puts a chill down my spine. I'm like, it's, we'll get into that afterwards if we need to. But so a partnership trip. And brought them together with a church in Gagiso, which is a township in South Africa, in a township where my grandmother lived, in fact. Now, as I say, St. George's is one of the wealthiest churches in Nashville. And the church that I partnered them with in Gagiso, this room is big compared to the church building in Gagiso that the church owns. I mean, I'm talking about the whole building, the sanctuary, the priest's offices, the Sunday school class. This is humongous. These people would have a party if we gave them a building this size. And they asked to meet with the outreach team from this church in Gagiso. The people from the church in Nashville asked, we'd like to meet with the outreach team, find out what are they doing as outreach into the community. We want to find out where we can work together. And so the very first day, the rector said to them, we don't have an outreach committee because we don't think that what we do in the community is outreach. We believe that that's part of our lived faith. And so everybody in the church is part of our outreach community. If you would like to meet with people doing specific things in the community, tell us what kind of things you're interested in, and we'll tell you the people in the church who are doing that. So we have the women who do a lunch service for the children at one of the schools in the community. So you could meet with them, the people who are in charge of that, who do the shopping, the cooking, and all the rest of it. We have the women and men who do the visits to AIDS patients in their homes, who take care of them, cook for them, clean their houses, change them. So that we could let you meet with them. We could let you meet with the young people who are in charge of making sure that all the children in our community have school uniforms. Or we could let you meet with the people who do the collections for the shoes, so that children have shoes for. But I mean, by the end, if you want to meet all the people involved in what you call outreach, we'd have to have a church meeting. We'd have to have the whole parish here for that meeting. And this church, this parish, would be considered poor. I mean, as they say at home, poor. Not just poor, poor. Really, really poor. And yet, they are first responders in their community. They have taken it upon themselves to be those who feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of the widow and orphan, look after those who are dying, and watch over the children-headed households. So part of this is a backdrop to the story I'm really telling you. So the people in Nashville decided that, each year, now, they actually started a partnership with that church, and they go back to South Africa each year, without me, I might add, nowadays. Even though I really would like a vacation home once a year, that would be really nice after all my hard work, but I digress. And each year they take up a project that they're going to work with the church in South Africa. And 3 years ago, the project that the church in South Africa identified was to upgrade the home of a group of some children, a child-headed household, where both parents had died, and now the head of household was a 17-year-old girl, and that they wanted to make their house more beautiful, that they wanted the children to have beds, and so this was a home identified by the women volunteers at the church who were working with children-headed households. And so we spent a day, they painted the house, bought furniture, put up curtains, bought toys for the kids. This is the church from Nashville, did all of this stuff with their partners from the South African church. And so in the midst of doing all the work, two of the women who were volunteers from the church who had identified these young women, this young family, said, you can come over to my house, and, to have a drink, telling us, to rest. And they walked us about 4 houses down from where these children were living. And their houses were as poor as the houses of those children. And what I said was, now, that's why we can't call it outreach. And that's why we can't speak about African women as simply waiting. Because if these women had wanted to, they could have identified their own houses as the place that needed help and needed the money and energies of saying, I will not name the church, of the church. But they knew that the real need was these children's need. That as much as they needed themselves, they knew that there was a way that they could make things happen for themselves. Even if they weren't sure how they were going to make those things happen. But that they recognized the greater need of this children-headed household. All of this to say that when you think of women of Africa, I ask you to not simply think of those pictures that you see on TV of women just sitting, waiting to be saved. Not to say that that does not exist, but that is not the predominant story. If we are going to be about raising women's voices, telling women's stories, let us at least make sure we are telling the real stories. If we are not going to be able to allow women of the developing world to tell their own stories, at the very least, let us be about making sure that the stories we tell capture the full humanity of these women, because they are fully active, participating. They are fully politically and economically aware of their needs and of their abilities. That they are fully living, not simply waiting to be acted upon, even if that acting is on their behalf. When I think of the challenges and the opportunities that face women of Africa, I think one of the biggest challenges is to ensure that those women recognize their great contributions, that they recognize what it is that they give and do for their communities and for the world. That when I think about what it is that I hope for the women of Africa, it is that the world come to see them as fully participating in their lives. That the world come to recognize them as people who have stories to tell and the words and voices to tell those stories. When I think about what the role of women will be, I believe that when and only when we come to recognize the contributions that women make, to fully recognize the contributions that women make, when we come to recognize how much we as communities, as nations, as a world suffer because women's power and voices are so diminished in most arenas, that because of that, we are in the mess we are in. That when we as a world come to recognize our need for one another, developing, the so-called West, so-called Africa, Asia, men, women, different races and ethnicities and religions, that when we come to recognize our need for one another and come to recognize that there is no way that we are going to survive, let alone thrive as a community, when voices of a large part of our community are silenced and stifled, when opportunities for a large portion of our world are closed off. When we come to that realization and we start to appreciate the voices and gifts, the varied voices and gifts that we need, then it is then and only then, I believe, that there will be no more 9/11s to be commemorated. Thank you.